Hello and welcome back. Today, I'm really excited to talk to you about the subject of restorative justice and the cultural soma, or the cultural nervous system. So, really about what is a cultural somatic type of approach to restorative justice or transformative justice. So that's kind of the topic today, and I think this is a really important thing because if you follow cultural somatics, or at least the rituals justice school or the Raj school's approach, we really look at cultures as bodies. So groups of people are bodies. So bodies make up bodies, and that's kind of like the framing. So everything that is applicable to the repair and alignment of our individual somas, is also applicable to the repair and realignment of the larger somas that we form together as bodies, right? And so when we're talking about that, you'd really start to see that what people call justice is really a part of this repair and realignment process. And so just as the same ways that, when you look at holistic health and medicine, proposing new ways of, new and old ways, right? New and old ways of having a healthier way to repair and realign our bodies. I think all those kind of wisdoms are also applicable and to transfer to the healing of our collective body, right? And that's what we really think about. That's what we really think about when we're, conceptualizing what does restorative or transformative justice look like for us. So, in jumping into the subject, I first wanted to actually take a little, maybe not a detour, but going down one layer in terms of the foundation and building building up our conversation, on a concept. So this is something that we talk a lot about in our cultural somatic school, but about subtle and dense layers of life and the importance of understanding the existence of how subtle and dense layers of life kind of map onto each other. So what does this mean? It's kind of actually just like kind of a more abstract, maybe and fancy way of saying, and some people would say like the yin quality of life and the yang quality of life. So the yin is like the subtle, the fluid and tangible, and the yang, which is like the structured, more formed, tangible quality of life. Another place where you might understand subtle and dense is when you look at quantum versus Newtonian physics. So in Newtonian physics, you might have Sir Isaac Newton like observing an apple falling from the tree, and you're like, oh, this is gravity, right? And that's a big deal. But it's an observation that we can have with kind of our tangible mind, the mind that grasps the tangible aspects of the phenomenon around us. Whereas when you get into quantum physics, which changes the level of perception, the depth of perception that we have, kind of from the naked eye to something a little bit more gooey and intuitive and close up or even far out, right? Changing the perception, you start to see that time behaves in ways that we don't imagine. Things are particles in ways at the same time. The world is full of nothingness, even though it looks like there's a lot of things. Basically our sense of the world changes when we change our level of perception. And then often the things that we find in the subtle realm often contradict actually what we think of in the dense realm, right? So there's actually this paradox that our life is based off of. There's subtle and dense layers. And we believe that it's really, really important to gain the skill of moving back and forth our awareness of things from the subtle to the dense. And this is something that's extremely important for us to understand. In a very practical sense, like an example, how this might be important, you might look at, let's say, dealing with a tumor, right? So in a traditional allopathic model, like dealing with a tumor, you might call this in a dense way, would see like, oh, if there's a tumor, we take a scalpel, we remove it, or we fight it with chemicals, or some kind of like we're going to attack the tumor itself. That's like a dense way of seeing it. It's like kind of the level of perception that is like immediately available, right? And this is not necessarily wrong, but the subtle way might look like, oh, this is a tumor, but a tumor is essentially a manifestation of the relationships a person is in. So it might be family trauma, cultural trauma, systemic oppressions that the person is dealing with, stress, even within the body, lack of circulation in the blood and lymph nodes. This is the kind of thing that the subtle looks at. So, you address this whole system. And the interesting thing I find is that in the short term, the dense stuff makes sense. You remove a tumor, and the theory is that that's the end goal. The problem is that in the long term, when you actually look at it, you see that if there's no shift in the subtle realm, the things that we apply at the dense realm kind of just revert back. So, if you remove a tumor, but the person's level of stress, trauma, financial burden, all that kind of stuff doesn't go away, the tumor will come back, or something else will come up that's kind of serves kind of the same purpose. So the same ailment will come up, and that's what really illness is within a kind of a subtle energy medicine type of context. Okay, so I find this really, really important to understand when we're talking especially about what we call violence. And this is kind of the thing that restorative and transformative justice are trying to work with, right? Because when you analyze first violence from a dense lens, from a tangible lens, you see that maybe one party harmed another, or maybe they harmed both, but there was harm between parties. And that's kind of the process that you're trying to the process of justice is trying to deal with that, trying to make repair with that, changing behavior and all that stuff, which isn't problematic, but what it starts to miss is that there is these other things around it. So there's systemic issues, there are family traumas, and all these other things that kind of bring a person to, commit an act of violence. Right, and that's a subtle realm, or starting to get into the subtle realm. I still think that's a little bit dense, but in our cultural somatic approach, I think we like to take it a little bit more subtle, okay? And if you refer back to kind of the basics of cultural somatics, or the basic understanding of cultural nervous systems within cultural somatics, so that is the idea that we have a nervous system, and our network of nervous systems make up this collective nervous system with an unconscious, with a consciousness, with desire, need. It gets activated, it gets deactivated, it goes through all the things that our nervous system does. We talked about inside of that nervous system there being a field in which our memories exist kind of as beings, if that makes sense. So we have ancestral memories, but that's actually kind of meaning that there's ancestors actually, or spirits, these kind of beings that are understood often to be in our collective unconscious. They really are. They have a body. It's not a tangible body, but it's in this collective body that has actually a lot more agency and a lot more expression and manifestation than we think. So the kind of beings that exist in this cultural nervous system are, again, ancestors, spirits as we used to call them, thought entities, quote unquote, white supremacy would be one, or social justice could be a thought entity. Anything, and we call these thought entities is sometimes called memes, so or mimetic entities. And memes, you could MEMES, you could Google that. Google's your friend. It basically means this idea that thoughts and information actually have some kind of drive to propagate. Okay, so in this kind of cultural nervous system and the unconscious that it's hooked into, it's alive with beings, right? And so the cultural somatic kind of understanding to the origin of violence is that the agents of violence actually are a lot more having to do with this collective field that our bodies have access to. And I can talk to you a little bit about how this happens. So when we get triggered and we experience some kind of activation, right? And we're trying to activate, and this is not a 0 or 100. It's actually kind of it's a lot more of a fuzzy spectrum, right? But when you start activating, right, you're starting to lose a little bit of the agency and choice you have over your body. You're starting to dissociate a little bit, if that makes sense, right? And one way to understand this is actually go to the extreme of like dissociation, or so somebody who might be considered sociopathic, right? So are maybe constantly dissociated, don't have agency of their body, right? And then what happens is when we start to lose agency is that this body can be taken over by patterns in this larger cultural nervous system, right? The traumas and things like that are underneath can surface into individual or kind of group human behavior, right? So, so this traumas in the cultural nervous system can surface into individual or collective human behavior, right? And when I mentioned, like sociopathy, I think a really good example of this is exactly like somebody like Ted Bundy. So when you actually watch interviews with Ted Bundy, he actually talks about there being visions in his head or voices in his head telling him to do things. And I think that's like something that's very hard for us to understand within just a dense frame. So often like people would say, oh, he's having psychiatric issues, he's hearing voices, right? And one of the things that he was experiencing was like images, I think, of murdered women, and it became an obsession of him that became like eroticized, right? It's that, if you really think about it, the visions he's having is as where are they coming from? And if you actually track the history of Western Empire, you'll realize that Western governments has been doing the kind of things Ted was doing in his life on an institutional mass level. So that we're talking about the witch hunts, right? So when you start to understand that, you may start to see that like somebody like Ted, because of their dissociation, very likely connected to that, they're accessing a collective field. And so what's entering through them is like this massive trauma that is about the collective. It's not that much about Ted's lifetime here right now. But what happens is that when you have this kind of access, and sometimes it comes in visions, it doesn't have to. It can come in more subtle forms like body impulses and stuff. And you don't have a system or people around to say, like, hey, do you notice what this is happening? Do you see that you're accessing this larger field? You just tend to not be able to differentiate what is coming in from the collective field from your individual agency and sovereignty, right? And that means that your nervous system is going to further get overloaded. In case of Ted, it became an obsession. And, part of that obsession is kind of like this eroticization. That is like the process. That's like a hugely blown up, kind of made extreme vision of like probably, what you could say is happening with most forms of violence, right? So there's activation, and then there's this collective thing that comes through, and then the threshold is reached, and the activation is too much because the individual is not able to separate what's their material and what's coming from the collective and the collective trauma that they're part of, and then violence happens because it hits a certain threshold. And this can happen in a very short amount of time. Like let's say when you look at like the frequent kind of shootings of like young black men because people get activated, they're dangerous. My theory about that is, yes, there's this individual level activation, but that's just really only like the kind of the quick beginning. It's really when that dissociation starts, then this program, you might say, in this larger collective field routes through the body, and then the person commits the action. And some people might argue that well, what about then like somebody who's like a white supremacist who wants to do those kind of things? And I would probably say that actually that means that person is like permanently open. I mean, all of us are a bit permanently open in a sense. All of us are permanently a bit, if we have any level of trauma, we're going to be a little bit open to that collective field all the time. But maybe somebody who's a white supremacist is that hole, in their kind of agency, I don't know how else to describe it, is permanently open to that kind of program, downloading all the time, and they're always getting their threshold of their agency surpassed, right? So really what we're saying here then is like the violence is really a result of what the elder cultures or ancestral cultures of ours called spirit possession. And actually, when you look, I forgot which nations this was, but when you look at like animist schools of wisdom on Turtle Island, in these First Nations, there's like a idea of there being like a cannibal spirit. It's called a Wetiko or Wendigo that takes over the body and the person commits violence. And Wetiko or Wendigo, I think is like a nice way to personify it. And our understanding is that when you look at Wendigo very closely, you'll see it's actually a network effect of different traumas that have kind of like created this cloud being that acts through and enacts this kind of spiritual possession. So understanding that, right? And then coming back to like, what is, the relationship between, ailment and the subtle realm? Like when we talked about a tumor, the tumor is kind of like an indicator of the network of relationships and distortions with it. I would say the same about violence when it happens. So the violence is not just about the individual parties that were directly involved. It's actually about this larger collective field. And that's kind of the place we really need to look towards. And I do think restorative and transformative justice is a direction towards that. But when we bring in atomism and an understanding of a cultural soma and a cultural nervous system, I think we can expand that a little bit even more and a little bit make it even more subtle to really start to see that violence is a spiritual problem. And that's actually the reason why we came up with the term or name rituals justice, because we were like, well, how else are we going to do this? So if it's really Watiko or Wendigo that is causing all this violence in our communities, you can't trap Wendigo or Watiko into a cell. You can't even put them through an accountability process because they're not part of the tangible realm. They'll just kind of walk out of the room, right, if we're not paying attention to them. So we wanted to talk a little bit about like, actually what we do need is ritual. We do need a way to go directly into the collective field and work directly in that space. And so how we have been talking about restorative and transformative justice is moving towards like a more kind of ritual model where we understand, let's say, the parties that have harmed, the parties that have been harmed, the family, the friends, the community, the village, that whole collective of beings. The justice process is a process by which they offer a gateway into the collective field and kind of repair and realign the distortions that are happening. Just like if there's a tumor that comes up in our body, there is like kind of, it's like an opportunity, a gateway to go into this larger field. And, I understand that a lot of restorative and transformative justice discourse talks about that in terms of like addressing systems of repression. And I think what I'm saying is like, okay, that's actually, if we want to get there, if we want to get to like reforming these systems of oppression, if we want to get to healing white supremacy or misogyny in on an individual level, we do need to go down another level deeper to really touch the source of where the violence is originating from by doing this kind of spiritual work. And the inspirations of thinking about this stuff, for example, is the traditions of many indigenous communities. So there's a documentary called Hollow Water, which is, I think, about a First Nation in Manitoba, but they're dealing with childhood sexual abuse and the rampant kind of proliferation of that. And it's, and they realize like, we can't dispose of people. We can't rely on the traditional justice system of so-called Canada to deal with this. And so they kind of enlivened, their indigenous animist knowledge and held healing circles that were about reintegrating, people who have perpetrated that kind of violence back into the community. And so that's definitely a huge inspiration for the work. Other kinds of work that also has like kind of indigenous animist foundations, but are, often thought of as, Western modalities. So that would be like process work or process-oriented psychology, family constellation work, and then there's also like restorative circles. Those are all kinds of like modalities that we're really inspired by. And we see that all that work, which all those kind of modalities are about accessing some kind of collective field in a circle. And I think what we're wanting to or thinking about is how can we then really then move into the place of not just supposing that there might be these entities that possess us and things happen, to really work with that premise. So really working with that premise of there being, spirits that intervene in our lives, and we need to work with them directly. And this is something that I had a conversation with Larissa Call, who's like a colleague of mine, and also happens to be the partner of Dar Sohe, who's my often co-creator. And they when we talked, they talked about there needing to be a real switch in our thinking, and really creating solutions based on this idea of, and this normalization of this idea that there are things more than human impacting our lives, and just start with that basis rather than there might be, or trying to work towards that. What happens when we build the solutions on that assumption, and also normalize that idea. There needs to be more normalization of that. So that's kind of the things we're working with. So and touching on that, normalizing and getting used to that, this really means, I think, for us, is that because spirituality is a big part of violence, or it's the foundation of violence. So violence is a spiritual problem. I believe you need spiritual help to actually do restorative, transformative justice work. So, if you can imagine, it's if you're going to fight a dragon, you're hoping you're riding on a Pegasus, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? If you're going to deal with a god, you need the gods on your side too. You need help in that realm. So a lot of the work that we're doing at the Scool and what we'd like to share right now is actually about building that kind of foundational capacity. And honestly, that's kind of the stage we're at. There's, I think, further experimental processes we need to work with to look at, okay, so now that we have this capacity, what does actual restorative and transformative justice look like in community when it's pragmatically engaged? This is a big question, so respect to a lot of the people who are doing it out there, really honoring that. And we're just kind of where we are, trying to build some capacity so we can be part of that conversation more. So yeah. And finally, I think I want to address a little bit of something that might be coming up for a few people here, is that this idea that, oh, well, if violence is a spiritual problem and there's possession, does that mean let's say a white supremacist is not accountable for the violence or their behavior? Where does individual accountability and responsibility go, right? And that might be a huge sticking point for a lot of people to view the world that way. And something I would say is it's actually, my response to that is quite simple, is that sure, we, in violence, when we enact it, we don't actually have a lot of agency of having done it. We just simply don't. That's just not how our nervous system works. But just because we don't have that agency doesn't mean that we don't have the responsibility to gain that agency. And I think that's a fundamental building block of being part of a healthy village society, is that we individually, every one of us, has a responsibility to become more and more sovereign and more embodied and less permeable, and have more choice around what kind of collective the expression of the collective field through us. We're able to actually make better choices around that. That's really, really foundational. So it's not that individual responsibility for repair and all that stuff goes away, or changing behavior. That's absolutely still there, but it's more to see it in the it's probably very separate from kind of a punishment frame, in the sense of no, there's responsibility that you need to take, and to gain agency. Doesn't mean that you have agency when you are in a state of doing violence, though. And I think that's something that it needs to be separated a little bit. Maybe a simpler way to put it is that everybody has the responsibility, for trauma healing. In cultural somatic approach, I think we definitely instead of seeing that as a kind of luxury or it kind of like a thing that we do when we, it is a thing that we do when we can. That is absolutely true. But it's kind of like to understand that like when we have trauma in our bodies, and as we all do, the more and more power we gain, the more and more susceptible we are to go over threshold and do violent things. And it's a responsibility for us. The more and more power we're asked to hold and we consent to hold it, that we have done the work internally to not abuse that power. And I think we all have that responsibility. And something that you might notice in this frame is that this kind of like responsibility is kind of like not just with, it's a responsibility-based frame, I think what I would say. It's not necessarily built around being kind, because I feel like maybe there's a little bit of flavor of kind of alternative justice approaches that are about being kind. So like, when you're in front of somebody who has done harm, you're like, oh, I have compassion for you and kindness. And it's like, that's not totally it. It's more like, oh, you have a responsibility. I will support you in fulfilling that responsibility, but you really do need to fulfill that responsibility. It's not just I don't find kindness is necessarily a frame. And at the same time, somebody who's been harmed, that doesn't mean that their responsibility and capacity goes away, because once that person's been harmed, is traumatized, you flip it around, and now they're a person who is maybe more vulnerable to some kind of possessed state, and they're able to, they say violence begets violence. So that there's something about really important about recognizing that it's not about being kind to each other. I mean, of course that exists, that's a possibility, but there's also firmness inside, because I think it's really about responsibility, and responsibility, asking people to be responsible can be gentle and guiding, but it can also be firm and assertive. And I think that's kind of a little bit of the flavor that we're also moving towards, because this might be the final thing, but when I conceive of cultural somatics as a kind of meta modality, I see that it's not just a therapeutic art, that is surrounded around gentleness and client-centeredness and guidance. It also needs to be a bit martial. And this is, actually quite ancestral, because if you actually go to Asia, you see that most people who do energetic healing and hand healing, they learn some kind of martial art as well at the same time. That's a part of their training. It's actually only really in, in the West, so-called, quote unquote. I mean, it's kind of like a binary framing, but if you know what I mean, I think, is that healing and martial quality is separated in understanding a little bit more. Right? And it's not totally separate, because I know a lot of people who do somatic work do martial arts, but it's not, I don't think it's necessarily seen as integrated into each other. And when you do move over to Asia, you start to see that, oh wait, people are really conceiving these as very, very adjacent. And I think that sensibility is actually quite important. Understanding restorative and transformative justice within a cultural somatic frame is that, like, it's not just about that gentleness and guidance. There is like the requirement sometimes of firmness, in the sense of like, the kind of like, I guess, like archetypal story is like there's a villager who's been possessed by, a spirit, and is waving around a torch in the middle of the town square. There's a level of firmness that has to, that might harm, like the intervention might harm like the body of the person who's possessed. I'm not advocating for violence, but I'm saying, like, and if you think about it, the origins of these martial arts are very likely about like how to deal with that situation where you're not trying to, where you need to stop the thing that's happening, but you're trying to do the least amount of harm, right? And that sensibility, I think, is not divorced from the sensibility of healing and gentleness. They form. So one way to think about it, one is the subtle, so it's a kind of therapeutic healing, the kind of kind, and the other side is like more formed, assertive, has a structure, and it's firm. So these are the qualities of cultural somatics, especially when we're looking at any kind of alternative justice approach that I think is quite relevant. So yeah, I just wanted to conclude this video talking a little bit about that. And I hope overall you had like good experience taking it in. Maybe, yeah, some of these things are old, maybe some of these things are new, maybe something's being lurking around, but yeah, I hope that was informative for you. Thank you.